Ladies, gentlemen, and Harajam of all ages, the PTR for Diablo 4's 2.0 update and the Vessel of Hatred expansion has been active for a couple of days now, but the first 2 days were specifically intended to be used to test things like leveling and progression. The things like level 50 to 60, which is the new level cap, or even just things like level 1 up to max now that the whole, progression of everything has been completely reshuffled. Today, however, the final bit of full functionality was added to the PTR. Runewords have been unlocked, which expands the testing ability a significant amount to one of the major new mechanics starting in the game next season. And the character boosting features are now all active, which means that we can actually do things like instant level boost, instant codex of power filling out, instantly getting all of the uniques for your class, and even all the mythic uniques, just so we can literally test everything. Just a ton of things that let us get a really good sort of general feel for how things are going to be in the later stages of the game come Season 6. Though of course with the caveat that we don't have the actual seasonal stuff in the game yet, though we do know what it is thanks to stuff that is already in the game and the character creation screen of the PTR, so we'll talk about that a bit at the very end. But before that, of course, we have the new mythic uniques that are in the game now, which are worth discussing as well, especially as we gain even more avenues of crafting these by exchanging runes next season. All that said, today we're going to sort of break down anything new going on here in this, and then we'll just sort of talk about both the community reaction and our own feelings as well here on the channel about the version of the game that we have access to on the PTR right now, and all of these massive changes, how big of an effect that they will have, and whether it's a good effect or a bad one, and what I think could maybe use a bit more work. First things first, and the biggest thing worth talking about is the whole level and stat smush in general. The numbers being squished is a great thing. I have no problem with this. It is sure a bit jarring to adjust to at first glance, but it is definitely better for the game in higher end builds to not just be an uncountable number of digits on each damage number and things like that, even though I do still hit for millions easily in the endgame in my proper setup. And probably the best example of this feeling better though is that the max armor cap for damage reduction at maximum level is now exactly 1,000 instead of some relatively arbitrary feeling number over 9,000. Getting the extra 10 skill points from level 50 to 60 as well is quite interesting for how it lets you work around your skill tree in new ways, but importantly even more than that, these skill trees themselves are completely changed in the way that they function now. Not to mention that we expect to get a bit more of these skill points as well from Renown in the new region that is added in the expansion, so you will have even more points in this on live to go through these newly edited skill trees, which do things like let you access passives depending on which actives you take, which honestly just adds a whole lot more avenues for synergy between certain aspects of classes that just sort of make sense, honestly. As well, there's the new passives, the new key passives, and each class has also gained one new active skill such as Dance of Knives for Rogue, which is essentially just Whirlwind playstyle wise, but on a Rogue, and it actually is functionally a bit differently, and honestly, it's quite fun as the one that I've been able to mess around with the most myself. But then of course there's the fact that we now have the ability to get up to 300 Paragon points before counting Renown, and the full rework of Paragon as a whole. A lot of these changes I think are honestly great. There's of course a lot of balancing that does need to be done on the new Paragon system specifically, a lot of number tuning, but the main thing for me is having 5 maximum Paragon boards feels really sort of weird in combination with also having almost 50% more Paragon points than we used to have. We have way more points and way less choice in how we spend them, way less options, and personally I think while it does simplify probably what was the most confusing aspect of the game, as now you are by the end of it basically just going to be taking every blue, yellow, and orange node on all the boards that you selected because you don't really have a choice not to, that means that it also simplifies what is one of the more interesting expressions of build creation in Diablo 4. Because a perfect Paragon board before with like 6 active glyphs and like 8 legendary nodes, if you were actually able to do that, whatever the best your class could actually achieve, was just a true thing of beauty, and it just felt so great when you were able to put it together properly. Now it feels like we are just really forced to choose only the best of the best boards, only the best of the best glyphs, nothing for fun, nothing interesting, nothing comfortable, nothing utility, and then we just sort of have to have a ton of actual Paragon points to fill in the parts of the boards that used to go mostly unused. I wouldn't mind at least one extra board in this setup with the amount of points we have. Having the starting board included in the 5 though does feel a bit constricting. It wasn't what I was expecting when they first said 5 boards, but I suppose they would rather the game get simpler over time, honestly, rather than more complex. They don't want it to be just sort of intimidating for newer players or just more casual players either. I just am personally on the sort of opposite side with this one, where I think that some complexity is good, and I think this was a good place to have it. Then we have the LFG system, the party finder, group fighter, whatever term you want to use for it. This has been sort of on and off with the way its functionality has been in the PTR. Sometimes it's working, sometimes it's not, but the idea is that it allows you to group with other players in a relatively simple way. And while it is absolutely full of bugs on the PTR that will hopefully be fixed on proper launch, the base system is extremely solid. It's super easy to just open up the party finder finder, set some tags, choose the activity that you actually want to do. Maybe you want to be blasting nightmare dungeons, you can tell it that you want to do exactly that. Then you can see what groups are doing that and just join and instantly teleport to them in the middle of their dungeon. Or if there's no groups, you can start one yourself with just a couple of button presses, honestly. It's a fast-paced addition to the system, it is constant action for the game, and outside of just giving you more options for ways to play the game, it allows players who are usually a bit more solo-focused to engage with the hyper-efficiency of group clearing activities, which has typically just been the best way of doing pretty much, honestly, anything in the game all the way since launch. Past that, of course, there is the general difficulty system that has changed in the game, and the progression changes in general, with us now having essentially 8 tiers of difficulty to choose from, 4 for leveling all the way up to 60, 4 for endgame that you unlock past 60. I recognize that generally speaking, I'm in a very small percentage of players that wants the game to kick my ass in the best gear you can possibly physically farm in the game, so that there is a mode that is still challenging even in 10 out of 10 perfect gear and a genuinely perfect build. But I still think that it makes sense to have a difficulty for that. Right now the hardest difficulties are relatively hard, but they are far from unattainable or unmanageable. You can still kill bosses in nightmare dungeons in absolutely moments. You can kill the actual boss ladder bosses in Torment 4 relatively quickly, and I still have a few pieces of my legacy gear on even, so I'm missing a fair amount of the new stuff added in. I'm missing a ton of raw item power as far as literal raw stats and numbers on the affixes, and I'm still mostly able to just manage absolutely fine in Torment 4 because the build I'm using is solid. Though of course there is a little bit of pushback, and while it is fine, generally speaking, I think there's nothing wrong with having even a difficulty tier that is usable before level 60 that most players would struggle to do without being on like an alt with some hand-me-down gear, maybe even some mythic uniques you got from another character. Because what that does is make more fun experiences either for the people capable of pushing into that difficulty or for the people who do eventually do ults in a given season, but I digress. That isn't really what they're aiming for here. The scaling difficulty of the world and activities, as well as the rewards, is far superior to the current world tier system on the live servers. There is way more variability between the tiers. There is far more player agency and choice when it comes to controlling the risk and reward factor of activities, even things like Helltide or your Whispers of the Dead, your Nightmare Dungeons, all of your things out in the open world as well, your world bosses too, honestly, and your ladder bosses. And on the whole, it honestly is absolutely a positive, though I think one day they could definitely perhaps consider adding more difficulty tiers even past our current ones, past the 8 that we're currently getting. Torment tier 4 can be a bit challenging for the first couple of days with uncompleted gear. That was my experience, without max item power equipment and aspects, and without the Runewords or the new mercenary system we'll have in the expansion as well. But we got access to some of that in the update to the PTR earlier today, and even without having all of it, as some of it is literally locked to the expansion, the difference is incredibly huge. A good build has no problem on Torment 4 with Runewords and proper gear, and it's looking like the hardest difficulty will simply just be not too hard for the people who play the game a lot. And I think that there should maybe be at least one difficulty that is still a challenge even when you're fully built, even in overpowered builds. Maybe that's a bit much to say for some people, but it's sort of like the original idea behind the pit, to have tiers that no player is able to complete just because they should exist as an option for you to do if it's something that you want to. Even if most people will never see it, it doesn't negatively affect the people that don't, does it? As for the changes to gear then, the main complaint that I'm having myself and also hearing from other people is they feel it's just really oppressively bad how gear feels before you have ancestrals. The drop rate for ancestrals in the new setup of the itemization is very low. Even in world tier 4, a very small percentage of the gear that actually drops will be ancestral. And now, non-ancestral gear is locked at 4 out of 12 masterworking at most, and only having 1 tempering affix as opposed to 2, which you can have in ancestrals. So it just makes it feel way less good to be in the sort of middle stage of the game where you are getting all of your high item power gear, but none of it is ancestral. It just makes you feel like you're a lot weaker than you should be given the item power the gear itself says. A lot of the items that we just sort of took for granted last season and before that are going to be big moments of excitement when they drop in season 6 and beyond. And while you could look at that as a positive, I do think it's a little bit tough to adjust to when the reason for that is that anything but ancestrals just feels very underwhelming right now. It feels like there's very little item journey to them, there's very little you can do to actually power them up once you get them, which is unfortunate because of how long it takes to actually get ancestrals to drop. Not to mention, if an ancestral drops, and it can just be worse than your non-ancestral, this often will happen with unique specifically, as you can have an ancestral happen with a low actual roll on the unique effect, or you can have the greater affix drop on the wrong affix and make it worse. You can just have a lot of negatives happen with this system. And then of course there's the concept that you can still brick these items, even the ancestrals. So if you finally get an ancestral for a slot you need it, maybe you've been missing a weapon ancestral for ages, so you've just been using an underpowered build with less damage because your weapon has lower weapon damage on it just as a base. You finally get one that is an ancestral, then you start tempering on it and you brick it. Then what? Well, you gotta wait for yourself to get another one. Or of course in the new expansion there will be something that you can get through the actual Dark Citadel activity, the group activity, which will let you to reset temper rerolls. However, that won't be very applicable to our first sort of progression through the game. And that's mostly what I'm talking about when we're mentioning your first sort of ancestrals, as once you have a set of ancestrals, getting more ancestrals is just a cherry on top. But the journey from hitting actual level 60 and above and getting a full set of ancestrals right now feels a bit rough. That's just my thoughts on it right now. Next up from that then, let's talk about the sort of quality of life and UI changes that have been added. Starting with something that a lot of people will love, a portable wardrobe function. You can use this from your character screen, you can swap your skins or color palette over in an instant without having to go back to town. And also worth noting that they added another 3 new armor dye palettes in with the PTR. This is all just 100% convenience and quality of life, and it's much better than the old system with it. They've added 2 more tabs to the inventory as well, one for specifically dungeon keys and one for socketables, meaning things like gems and runes, as well as another slot to the stash. This means there is just better inventory systems in place, and so less inventory management required, and that is always a positive, even if it's only little bits at a time. They expanded on the buff bar as well, so now it will have 2 rows if you have too many buffs, rather than just cutting off a bunch of your buffs, which made it very hard before for some builds to track when they should use certain abilities. So this is a very positive change for sure. And another big change that I actually somehow haven't mentioned up to this point is Paragon glyphs, and the fact that you can make them legendary now, which adds different multiplicative bonuses to every glyph. This means that in your Paragon board, while it is much more limited now, limited to 5 boards, you do only get to have 5 glyphs as a result, but each of those glyphs will be far more impactful than they have been in previous seasons once you've actually upgraded them to legendary at level 46 of the glyph, which gives you these multiplicative effects. The actual effect is different for each glyph, but generally they tend to match the sort of base bonuses of the glyph, either just giving you multiplicative damage, or maybe multiplicative crit damage if it's a crit glyph, or giving you multiplicative elite damage if it's an elite damage glyph, things like that. After that then, let's just take a bit to talk about the new Mythic uniques that have been added to the game that we are now able to test on the PTR as well, as they added the ability to literally spawn them in today with the boosting vendor. The 2 new ones that apply to all classes then are new armor mythics, and they are both quite good in their own right, but with a lot of competition for their slots. Heir of Perdition has a fantastic list of general affixes, including bonus core skill ranks and also 20% crit chance as a base on your helmet slot. That can be hit by greater affixes, that can be masterworked up, that 20% crit chance can be a lot higher, and it essentially is a secondary option instead of the Harlequin crest helmet as a mythic helmet. It gives you a ton of multiplicative damage increase, just basically 60% active all the time when you have it on, but you do lose out on armor, cooldown reduction, and damage reduction from using Shaco the Harlequin crest instead, so it's great if you're tanky, less so if you aren't, and if you only have the option of one to choose from, both are really good. This one is genuinely worth actually using in a lot of setups, and in some setups it is better than the Harlequin crest, as long as your build doesn't hinge on a specific unique helmet. Sorry, druids. Then we have the Shroud of False Death chest piece, and this is focused entirely around giving every class access to stealth if you don't attack for a couple of seconds, and boosting the damage of the attack that breaks stealth significantly too. Or at least that's what you might think if you just read the actual affixes on the armor and maybe the unique effect, but if you don't look at the inherent affix, you wouldn't realize the strongest part of this chest piece is the fact that it gives you +1 rank to all passives, and +1 ranks to all passives is crazy. If you don't realize how many passive skills there actually are in your skill tree, maybe open it up and have a look. Even in the live servers, there are a ton of passives, but there's even more being added in with the PTR and in with the new update, so +1 rank to all passives gives you an unbelievable amount of different effects and a ton of value. So this may not be as defensively strong as something like Tyrael's Might, which is like the premium defensive chest slot item in the game as another mythic unique. This one will give you a lot more actual possible utility and also damage, on top of probably giving you a fair bit of survivability too, just because again, +1 rank to all passives. Then there is the Shattered Vow polearm, the new one that executes enemies if they have more damage over time stacked onto them than they do remaining health. And honestly, the main thing that this can really be used for and by is just bleed barbarians. It's not bad for bleed barbarians by any means either, but it does take up the two-handed weapon slot, which is a high value location. How good it is just a little bit yet to be seen, but it is at least good enough to be worth considering in those specific types of builds and thinking about for the meantime. Then there is also the new Runeword mechanic that we just got access to earlier today, and I absolutely love the version of this that we have in Diablo 4. We were given the ability to use all of the runes from the get-go to actually mess with them and create fun combos, and from a simple standpoint, these are just way more impactful and interesting than the normal use of gem slots in the current game and the use that they had. They make notable differences in your actual power, you can synergize between them in really cool ways, and while for a lot of them the effect will take a bit of time or effort to trigger, they aren't firing off constantly, getting a really strong effect though every once in a while is absurdly worth it to engage with as a mechanic. Things like pulling enemies just through Runewords by themselves by invoking a Spiritborn skill, or increasing skill ranks by 3 when you trigger it, which is awesome, or about giving yourself an attack that is both guaranteed to crit and overpower, or making your next non-basic skill spend all of your resource to do more damage. There are tons of honestly cool combos you can achieve through these Runewords that will absolutely increase the depth and sort of the customization factor of builds once this comes to live servers. The combination that I was messing with most when this first opened up today was actually the ritual one that uses of core skills that are non-channeled in my barrage build, which I spam barrage constantly, pairing that with actually using Warcry from Barbarian, which means as a rogue, I had 100% uptime on berserking, which is a really just sort of interesting bonus buff to be able to have on a rogue. I then paired that with the ritual that actually triggers when you invoke a skill from another class, so when I use Warcry through the other Runeword, and that would then trigger Petrify if I did it 4 times, which is actually happening pretty frequently. This is a really cool just little combo. Obviously it's not a perfect synergy for my build because I don't really scale off crit as well as damage over time and vulnerable, but just the ideas is what I was messing with. The idea that you could just use a high attack speed core skill spamming build to just basically funnel into itself, creating another class's skill usage, which then funnels into itself to use a different class's skill as well, and I thought this was just really fun. I think the offering numbers could maybe use a bit of tweaking on some of the ritual runes. Maybe it's the build that I was messing with to begin with, but I did struggle to really gather enough offering to trigger my effects often outside of specifically the barrage build with the triggering on non-channeled core skills. But I don't also know what the intended frequency of these happening either. For all I know, the way that it feels in the build that it did do well with was too much for what they want. Long and short of it though, honestly, is that Runewords feel really good as a system. It's very cool to have this as an option. It adds a lot more options to builds, especially for things like crit builds, getting access to Petrify from the Druid, as that is just an insanely powerful effect to just add on top of whatever your full build was already. Then finally, as a sort of last thing, we have an interesting thing that has made it into the PTR as well, which is a description of the seasonal mechanics for Season 6 in the character creation screen. These things may change a bit before the season releases, but it is reasonable to assume that this was made intentionally, with the ideas already set in stone. The main thing here is the concept of Realm Walker monsters is a new sort of enemy type, and if you kill these, you can then go through a portal, which will result in a buff, according to the text here. Personally, I think they wouldn't word it this way if they meant like go through a portal and then you get some gear, go through the portal and you get to do a cool fight, so this reads much more like what shrines sort of act as, but hopefully much more potent and interesting in the actual effects they have, with the idea being that you would go through this portal and earn a power-up that affects you when you exit the portal for the next portion of whatever activity that you were doing before it popped up. It's definitely a very interesting concept, and it's neat to have a little teaser like this, but I think we need to know a lot more information about what these mechanics actually entail before we can judge it properly. That just about does it for today then everyone, just a full recap of how things are going on the PTR, our own feelings here on the channel, as well as my sort of gauge of the community reception too, and of course some talk about the newer things that we have only been able to start messing around with today properly. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and hopefully it gives you a bit of a glimpse into what to expect come Season 6 and our thoughts on everything so far. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.